The failure on the part of the establishment media to defend Julian Assange, who has been trapped in the Ecuadorian embassy in London since 2012, has been denied communication with the outside world since March and appears to be facing imminent expulsion and arrest, is astonishing. The extradition of the publisher, the maniacal goal of the US government, would set a legal precedent that would criminalize any journalistic oversight or investigation of the corporate state. It would turn leaks and whistleblowing into treason. It would shroud in total secrecy the actions of the ruling global elite. If Assange is extradited to the United States and sentenced, the New York Times, the Washington Post, and every other media organization, no matter how tepid their coverage of the corporate state, would be subject to the same draconian censorship. Under the precedent set, Donald Trump's Supreme Court would enthusiastically uphold the arrest and imprisonment of any publisher, editor, or reporter in the name of national security.
It's one of those miscarriages of justice, that's too mild a term, grotesque injustices, that it should manifest right in the heart of London is a disgrace. Assange isn't even allowed to go to a hospital and come back because they won't let him back.
When supposedly democratic nations behave so undemocratically that they ignore the law, I think it gives, it proves the lie to their claim of being democracies.
In the power of corporations to essentially pillage, loot, and destroy both the ecosystem and the nation state was put into place over the last few decades by creating systems of political paralysis, in essence, where by seizing all of the mechanisms of government, all of the institutions that once made piecemeal and incremental reform possible, and then diverting all of those mechanisms towards the further empowerment and enrichment of the corporate state and the global oligarchic elite, government no longer responded in any rational or meaningful way to the vast majority of the citizenry that it increasingly not only impoverished, but repressed by eviscerating privacy, abolishing due process, in the United States in particular, militarizing police so that they use lethal indiscriminate force against unarmed citizens, primarily citizens of color, putting in place as a form of social control the most monstrous system of mass incarceration in the world. We have 5%, we are 5% of the world's population. We have 25% of the world's prison population. Most of those people are poor people of color from these deindustrialized zones where they're forced, because there are no jobs, into the illegal economy. Poverty, in essence, is criminalized. Police in these marginal communities carry out what can only be called reigns of terror. And we can't forget about eviction. So you lock up the men and you evict the women and the mothers and children. And by evicting people every few months because they can't pay the rent, you further destabilize the community. All of this is by design.
They've got full spectrum violation.
Yes, they do. Yeah. Our police state in this country, the United States, imprisons more people, both in sheer numbers and the percentage of its population. There's no other country with as many people behind bars as the United States, and that is inherently undemocratic. More than 2 million people incarcerated, half of them are Black. I believe, I think it's 20% of all the people imprisoned on the planet are Black Americans. That's how bad it is. We have an armed police force who routinely, an average of 3 times every day, kill people. So this is not a democratic country. This is not a country that can talk about human rights. This is not a country that can scold other people and lecture them about their human rights violations when this is done so routinely here. And no, people don't like to hear it, but I don't care. I'm talking facts. I'm talking numbers. No one can dispute anything I just said. And so this is a country with draconian sentences for drugs, for all kinds of things, terrible racial disparities of all kinds. So we have a pretty bad human rights situation in this country. Also, the number of poor people. We have an increased amount of poverty, the government austerity, and that is also undemocratic, to consign a group of people to be poor forever. And that's pretty much how our country runs.
So we have just a mine of documents that have been declassified, either by the government or by exposure, like Dan Ellsberg and others. And when you look through these documents, anybody who's worked through them, I've spent a lot of time on them, and I'd urge you to look at them. What you find is that almost nothing is concerned with security of the population. And it's the opposite that's the case. Most of the documents are trying to keep what the government is doing secret from the population, which is the domestic population is the primary enemy. They are not supposed to know what we're doing, therefore it has to be secret. And when you look closely, you find this everywhere.
Many of the documents that we released as part of the Snowden reporting were top secret, although just quickly to follow up on one thing I'd said, just to give you a sense for how much these secrecy powers are abused, there are literally documents in what he provided that are things like the vacation schedules of various employees, rules for their lunchroom, how you make requests for time off, and at the top it will say top secret, which the standard is supposed to be grave harm to national security. And I think that's actually the bigger problem. The bigger threat is not that we might release a document inadvertently that shouldn't have been released because it's top secret. The much bigger threat is that your government, almost reflexively at this point, makes it a felony to disclose anything that they're doing, no matter how routine and no matter how standard.
Those who manipulate this unseen mechanism of society constitute an invisible government, which is the true ruling power of our community. And these ideas and this debate over propaganda and manipulation was very extensive in the first part of the 20th century. It was openly talked about. However, at some point in the 20th century, and Eddie Bernays, a direct quote from Eddie Bernays, says that, well, it came to get a bad name, this process of manipulation, this idea that in democracies you have to engage in managing the masses, etc. So he says, well, we had to rebrand it. So we came up with the term Council of Public Relations, and therein was born PR, public relations. And ever since then, we have been, people who employ propaganda have engaged in what Phil Taylor described as a euphemism industry. We have lots and lots of different terms which we use to refer to activities which we would have once described as propaganda. Whether it's psychological operations, strategic communication, public affairs, information operations, etc. These are all the terms you hear politicians and political actors using when they're talking about communicating with the public, etc. They don't use the term propaganda anymore. But as Phil Taylor pointed out repeatedly, this was essentially a way of disguising the fact that what's going on is some kind of manipulation. It's not a rational two-way process of trying to persuade people to agree with you. It's about manipulating them. And this is really one of the prime reasons why so many people have problems grasping the idea that we live in a society where propaganda is so prevalent and so important. It's been erased from our collective consciousness in a very significant way because of this euphemism industry. But we are in a world where there's propaganda, and we're in a world where governments and liberal democracies do employ propaganda to a very significant extent. Just some of the techniques of propaganda, which is worth mentioning. lying, when people think of propaganda, they often think of lying, that sort of, I'm being lied to by the government. But in many ways, sort of straight lies are some of the most ineffective forms of propaganda. Lying is normally politically fatal if you're caught out making a statement which is untrue, etc. So a lot of propaganda activities involve slightly more subtle forms of manipulation of information. That could be distortion of information, exaggerating. It could be omission of information, excluding facts which are inconvenient to the narrative that you're trying to promote. Misdirection is another very common technique where you direct people to think about one issue rather than another issue, and you're doing that because it's politically inconvenient for you to have people thinking about a particular issue. So misdirection is a commonly used technique. Incentivization and coercion. Incentivization, for example, offering tax cuts in elections and so on, is a form of trying to manipulate people. Some would say bribe people. Coercion is another form of propaganda. Sanctions, for example, is a coercive form of propaganda, trying to affect people's behavior and beliefs in target countries through employing sanctions. And the point of view of highlighting these aspects of propaganda is that propaganda isn't just about influencing people's minds in some kind of abstract fashion. It's also a much more sort of down-to-earth process in terms of pushing, coercing, and cajoling people. And it's worth keeping those ideas in mind, because the more you think about the society we live in and the more you think through these ideas, the more you start to realize that we are, in very significant ways, coerced and incentivized to behave in particular ways.
We have seen, and this was reported in The Guardian, I think, Glenn, you may have had some hand in this, that even in the modern documents, the same thing is repeated. The GCHQ, the British version of the NSA, which works on the basis of NSA technology, NSA even helps fund them, their documents quite bluntly stated in a classified document that could not be released to the public, it was an above top secret level document, said that what they were really concerned about if these programs became public was not the loss of lives, was not that attacks would succeed, was not that anything would slip through and we would be in danger, but rather, their words, quote, a damaging public debate on the scale of its activities would lead to legal challenges against the constitutionality of these mass surveillance programs.
The United States has almost immediately after Cuba achieved its freedom for the first time, 1959, within months the United States was attacking Cuba. Kennedy launched a very serious terrorist war, murders, brutal terrorist war. There's been economic warfare, harsh economic warfare. What's it for? Well, the secret documents tell us. Now that they've been released, we know what it was for. We find that it was because, I'll quote, because of Castro's successful defiance of U.S. policies going back to the Monroe Doctrine in 1823, which asserted, couldn't yet implement, but asserted the U.S. right to dominate the hemisphere. And Cuba was carrying out successful defiance of this doctrine. That can't be accepted. Goes on. The problem of the Castro idea is that it encourages people in Latin America to take matters into their own hands, an idea which will have considerable resonance in other countries aside from Cuba because of the historical circumstances, and we can't tolerate that.
Even people inclined to agree with a lot of what we're saying about the value of privacy ultimately run into that brick wall called terrorism, which is really just fear-mongering. You elevate people's fear enough and they're eager to run into the arms of authority. This is human nature that has existed for as long as human beings have. But let me just quickly address a couple of specific points with relation to terrorism and surveillance. First of all, the key difference is between targeted surveillance and mass surveillance. Nobody disagrees that targeted surveillance is legitimate. The idea that you have reason to believe that certain individuals are plotting violent acts against civilians and therefore you monitor their communications. If that's what the US government had been doing, you would never have known the name Edward Snowden. There would never have been a leak. That's exactly what they're not doing. What they're doing instead is mass surveillance. They've constructed the largest system of suspicionless surveillance ever created in human history, where they're targeting not specific individuals who are likely involved in terrorism, but hundreds of millions of people, entire populations, to very invasive scrutiny. One of the things that struck me when I read through the documents was how few of them have anything to do with terrorism. As Professor Chomsky was saying earlier, you read through documents and you're shocked by how little of it has to do with national security. There's tons of it that have to do with spying on economic targets, on oil companies, on economic conferences where countries negotiate trade agreements, spying for diplomatic advantage, spying on entire populations, including our own. Very little of this apparatus has been devoted to actual terrorism. And then the final specific point I want to make about that is that we always talk about, and your question suggested this, that there's a trade-off between security and privacy. So that if you want more security, you have to give up more privacy and let the government spy more, and vice versa. This is a really false dichotomy. And huge numbers of experts have said that when you allow the government to collect billions of telephone calls and emails every day, as the US government is doing, billions every day, that it is virtually impossible for them to find who's going to detonate a bomb at the Boston Marathon, or who is planning on blowing up a jetliner over Detroit, or detonating a bomb in the subway and airport of Brussels, or attacking a newspaper in Paris, because they're collecting so much information that they can't possibly find what they claim they're looking for. And if I know that, and if all these experts are saying that, they know that as well, which ought to really provoke the question, is it really the case that they're just so incompetent that they don't get this basic fact that if they collect everything, they won't know what they have? Or is there some other purpose to the spying system beyond the stated purpose of finding terror plots? And I think that ultimately is the key question.
Let me say that there are plenty of people who live constantly under the threat of terrorism. If you want to find them, go to Yemen or North Waziristan, where people don't have to be told about terrorism. They are constantly in fear that 5 minutes from now, the guy across the street is going to be blown away along with anybody else who happens to be around. That's massive global terrorism. And it has repercussions. And we're seeing some of the repercussions. What happened in Brussels was a monstrous terrorist act, but it's worth looking at the explanation that was given for it. ISIS took credit for it and issued a statement which basically said, as long as you keep bombing us, we're going to respond by attacking you. There's something to that. There's a real problem, but the answer, and we have to make a decision as to how to deal with it. One decision we can make is to follow the playbook that Al-Qaeda and ISIS have presented and want us to follow. Namely, and they're very explicit about it, destroy your own societies, destroy your own freedom and liberty, and get into a war with the Muslim world. That's their playbook. We can accept that if we like. We've been doing it for 15 years. If you go back 15 years to the launching of the so-called war on terror, terrorism, what we call terrorism, was located in a tiny area of tribal areas of what we call AFPAC, Afghanistan and Pakistan. Where is it now? All over the world. Every time you hit it with a sledgehammer, it expands. The invasion of Iraq, for example, one of the effects was that in the year following it, terrorism increased by a factor of 7. Intelligence agencies had predicted that it would lead to more terror, but it was way beyond. And that continues. There's another possibility, and that is to try to get to the roots and the causes of it and try to deal with them. It's not dramatic and exciting, but it would work.
What they're doing when they argue that the New York Times or the Washington Post or the Guardian or any other newspaper shouldn't be publishing stories about the secret activities of the government is they're trying to change the subject. They're trying to make us have a conversation about the theoretical risks of a free press that is enshrined in our First Amendment, rather than the concrete harms of the actual details of their operations that are being published.
The internet has become the most important device for revealing the truth, at least since the beginning of the printing press. It has become the #1 antidote to TV. Democracies are always lied into war. The Iraq War was a result of lies. The increase in involvement in the United States in Vietnam was a result of the Gulf of Tonkin incident, another lie. It's not just lies by intelligence analysts, it's lies by the big media machine. And what is in the big media machine? Well, it's the various institutions that get too comfortable and too close to the table of power, the very table that they are meant to be reporting on and policing and getting into the historic record.
In my dreams, I walk free in the city streets. 2,500 days plus 50 weeks. Doing hard time for these WikiLeaks. Trying to bring the truth out. Man, it only gets you heat. And then they gag you. You don't get to speak. And when you get the leak, they try to hit delete. The masses of the masses, they want the shit discreet. That's why my middle finger's up to these sick elites. Free speech, it's the freedom of press. Take your deepest, darkest secrets, never leave them unsaid. If I'm a thief, then I'm a